All right. Well, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as it's been for weeks now, we're coming to you live Friday on YouTube. So we're stoked that you're joining us. It's kind of cool, to have a Friday where you start out and you're like, so what's going on? So a lot of people start Fridays with the weekend, and so what does that mean for the weekend, and what do we have in store? And New Wine Uncorked wants to uncork the possibilities of life. Today, we're seeking to continue a conversation that has been kind of, if you've listened to or followed New Wine and specifically New Wine Uncorked, it goes through all the kind of conversations we have as to this idea of Christianity. And so we're always in dialogue. New Wine seeks to build relational bridges in contemporary culture through Jesus Christ. And one of the first things that you do for this is to begin dialoguing so as to understand actually, who we are, the situation that we're a part of. And one of those questions, one of the dialogues that continues to come about, because we have to do it just as far as who we are as people, is this idea of identity. What does it mean when you say I am? In today's culture, there is quite a bit of being asked to identify with this, or how do you identify with this, or even the talk of, so how do you present? I present as. And going all the way back in we've been involved with a number of different conversations. Jim and I have been, whether it's there's another platform that we do on social media called Clubhouse, which is an online app, and you're able to get on there, just download it from your app store called Clubhouse, and we have dialogues every Tuesday mornings from 8:30 to 9:30. And again, one of the questions that continues to come back to is, well, what does it mean when I say I am Christian? I am a Christian. Because if you've been able to be a part of our New Wine Uncorked, a while back we talked about certain aspects of missional work. And this Jim would brought up to us this doctrine called discovery. Doctrine of discovery, which outlined then early on what it meant to be Christian for certain people. Right? Like there's this aspect, this definition. We see it playing out today, believe it or not. In certain states right now, we have some politicians wanting to put further labels on TV shows. If there's certain people that are on the TV show, and if they have the interaction, they want a warning label. We have the congressional folks going back at it with the condition, the situation of abortion. What is right, what is wrong, and they're arguing with that. And as people, we're brought into these debates, these discussions, these dialogues. The question is not just as a person, but as one who claims the identity, the title Christian. What exactly does this mean? And if someone was listening to the four of us, would they walk away with an understanding of what it means to be Christian, or would they walk away with four different ideas of what a Christian is, going, I don't know? And so we want to continue this discussion coming from the mindset of four people who have sought an intentional seeking out of this person named Jesus Christ, and what that means in each of our lives, as well as the experiences that we've had, church leadership, working in businesses, working in different states, and continuing the dialogue through education. We've talked about each one of our different degrees and the pursuit of those degrees, theological degrees. So there's a good amount of background, education, experience, life. Do we even have the qualifications to begin to understand and define, talk about what it means to be Christian? So that's the dialogue that we're entering. We're stoked that you're joining us. You can join the conversation at any time through the comments right there to the right. If you look and you see the screen, if you're not on full screen, right to the right there is the chat option. Just throw your questions in there, your comments in there. And the smart ones of the bunch, meaning the ones on my right, if you're looking at it, so they're on my left. Phil is on the top and Jim's on the bottom, and they will bring you all the answers. And then I will just sort of do cleanup, and Kayla will button it up. So we have the ability to have a four square answer, but not four square denomination. So it's a beautiful thing. See how it always comes together, right? So when you hear I am Christian, do you think all four of us hear the same thing? Because to be honest, I wonder sometimes when people say Christian, do they actually mean that Christ is the beginning of that word and what that means for their life? Because for me, I look at the actions of Jesus and maybe I'm off because I don't know if he fits in 21st century the way we want him to. So I don't know. When I hear I am Christian, I'm thinking a life that looks to seek for the betterment of the other in creative ways. And I have to be honest, like sometimes I fail at that. So I wonder sometimes, what does it mean when I say I am Christian if I'm not pursuing the love of Christ? That seems to be sacrificial and giving for the sake of the other. If I'm about the pursuit of my stuff, how does that factor into yes, I am a Christian or no, I'm not a Christian? Like, so what do you hear? Phil?
Yeah, a couple of things. Um, First off, we have to differentiate between what we do versus our identity. When we talk about being Christian, because our identity takes on several different expressions, some good, some bad, but takes on a number of different expressions. And even that diversity of expressions can all still be rooted in Christ, can all still be Christian, but just look so many different ways. So differentiating what we do versus who we are. So I want to lean towards the idea of who we are when we talk about being Christian, because at the core of our identity, at the core of who we are, we're known by or in relationship with Jesus Christ. That's going to be at the core. And the expressions can take a lot of different ways, as I said earlier, but that's at the core. You're in relationship with Jesus Christ. That can have different significance within your life. Meaning that my relationship with Jesus Christ means I go somewhere for a couple hours on Sunday, or I pick up daily bread and consider something inspirational a couple of times a week. It could be something that, because the significance of that in your life could be the thing. But it begins with that relationship with Jesus Christ or being known by Jesus Christ. That's going to be for me. That's the core of it.
Do you think, I mean, do you think we have different views though, or understandings of what it means to be known, by Christ, Phil? Because I agree with you. There are different levels, maybe even. How do we define, what I'm saying is like, is there
Yeah.
because there's growth in our knowledge of Christ or being known in Christ.
And I'm not even in that regard. I'm not even saying us knowing Christ.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
saying
yeah,
us being known by Christ. I'm saying in the sense of depart from me, I never knew you kind of thing.
yeah.
That's the thing. And it's the relationship piece where Christ knows us relationally. Where we make that and that becomes the two different ways we can look at it. At least there's probably several ways to look at it. But does being known by Christ mean that I say that I'm a Christian, that I've stood up in a church and I've confessed my sin, I've been baptized, all those kind of things? Or do I do the work and that demonstrates my allegiance? Those kind of things happen, but because God knows all of us. But then there's the level of, okay, have I turned to him and said, no, I'm following you? And that begins the conversation and that begins the relationship. And again, the significance of how it plays out in our life becomes one thing, but definitely begins with being known by God and knowing him relationally. So yeah.
I agree. so, so I saw this clip the other day. I forgot when it was, but there's this clip of The Big Bang Theory. So there's a
Mhm.
knock on the door, and Sheldon gets up to answer the door, and he opens the door, and there's a woman standing there. She says, "I'm a special agent with the FBI." And so she kind of pulls out her, he goes, "Oh, show me your proof." And then so she pulls out this, her badge and shows it to Sheldon. And so Sheldon reaches in his back pocket and he pulls out a card. I think he said something like, "Well, I'm the member of the DC," or it's like, "I've got a membership card to the DC universe," and he holds it up and he goes, "But it doesn't mean I know Batman." And so it's and I think and I say that because I think when we say Christian, I think it's a title. I mean, it's like when you say a Christian, it's almost like you're part of this club. and so for me, and I feel like it's been hijacked, right? I mean, it's kind of like, it's almost like, hey, if you carry a Bible or if you say you're a Christian, you're a Christian. And so for me, I think there's times where I rather use the term as saying followers of Jesus, more describing what the role, what the responsibility is. And so, and I think, this is what I wrestle with, because I think the term Christian's been hijacked, but at the same time, is it like, do we want to recoup it? I mean, I think there's some things that, kind of this whole Christian deconstruction and all that. I mean, that's all good and well, but it's kind of like, it's just left a mess. And I think, I mean, it's been going, I mean, people have been deconstructing for like 20 years, I mean, and everybody talks about it like it's new, but it's like, okay, so how far do we keep going? And so I think there's a part of me where I think there's some terms that, people have deconstructed that are healthy terms and very descriptive terms and the very healthy terms. And I feel like we got to recapture those. And so I wrestle with, the term Christian, because there is a lot of other groups that call themselves Christian now. And so who are we to say, well, you're not a Christian? Because if you say, if there's another group that that, whether you own another planet or whether you're going to be a god of your own planet, and they say, I'm Christian, if we were to say, you're not Christian, we're going to be called judgmental, right? And so I think sometimes it's that term, Christian. I think politically it's been hijacked. I remember the word evangelical it's a healthy term, but that term's being hijacked, and some people are saying, let's leave it alone. But the term itself, evangelion, good news. And so I think, there's just, it's how we use it. I think it's hijacked. I question, and maybe this, I don't know what you guys think, but, are we a Christian nation? I mean, if we're going to say Christian, if we're going to use the term Christian, are we a Christian nation? So I get, so those are kind of my thoughts, is that while I think it's a term that's been hijacked, and it's more kind of like, it's like when Sheldon pulls out, the DC, membership card. It's like, well, see, I'm a member of this, and people, they just take, the part of, oh, I'm a member, I'm in, right? And I think Phil brings up a good point. Both of you guys bring up a good point. It's like, many will come in that day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not, blah, 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 blah. Did we not carry the Bible? Did we not do all these things? He's like, who are you? Who are you? So I think, the term Christian, it needs to be recaptured, but I use the term follower of Jesus because it identifies who I am, and I agree with Phil with, identity and who I am, but I like to be more descriptive as far as saying, I'm a follower of Jesus. So,
And before Kayla, you jump in, let me respond to something you said, Jim. I think that we lost. I mean, just what we've been talking about with Jesus saying, depart from me, I never knew you, kind of thing. The level of accountability when being called a Christian is a thing. If your identity is bound to Jesus Christ, that and again, I'm going to assume that at the core of it, if your identity is being bound to Jesus Christ, and what you do with that identity does not compare to what Jesus is doing, does not relate to what Jesus is doing, seems to even contradict who Jesus is, that becomes the level of accountability. So yeah, all right, we can say we're a Christian nation. Okay, we have an institution that we end up fighting a civil war over that wasn't mentioned in our Constitution. Is that Christ-like? No. So that answers that question. But the accountability piece of it, I think, is just as important. We have to have that accountability piece. And if I call myself a Christian, I have to say, well, this is how my life, the things that I do, relate to the things that Jesus has done, or parallels the model that Jesus has shown us. That has to be a part of the conversation too. And again, that's an in the church conversation that we should be having amongst one another. So yeah.
I think the key there is we should, right? Like, these are conversations that the church should be having, but are we? I don't know. I don't know if, a lot of churches do a really, really good job of preaching a message that makes you feel good. And you come on Sundays, if you come, and you feel good, and then you go home. Maybe even you hang out for an hour or two after at a coffee shop. But that's it for a lot of people. And so when somebody asks, like, oh, are you a Christian? Or, if somebody says to me, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, it's always interesting to have that conversation continue to unfold. because yeah, I think there are a lot of different, unfortunately, in a way, a lot of different views on what it means to be Christian, which is kind of weird because, like you said, Phil, it should be, like a relationship with Christ, with Jesus at the center. And I don't know. I don't know if Jesus is a huge factor for everyone who calls themselves a Christian, which doesn't make sense, because when you're saying Christian, the first part of that is Christ. But how many people who identify as Christian really care about Jesus, really love Jesus? And I mean, even us, right? Like, how much do we love Jesus? Is Jesus enough? These are questions that we've constantly asked and discussed on Uncorked, and they're questions that we have to continually ask ourselves, because it is a daily surrendering to Christ, and it's not an easy thing to do. But I don't even think that we necessarily step into these conversations as the body of Christ, as people who call themselves Christians. We're not stepping into those kind of conversations. We're not having that accountability and asking, so what do you mean when you say you're a Christian? What does that mean for you? What does that look like in your life? How can we push each other to grow? If we're both Christian, we should want to dive into that. We should want to be like, hey, what are you doing in your life, to follow Jesus, to know him more? Because I mean, we have different levels of friendship too, right? Like, you have the friends that you sit next to in class that you might ask about the homework. But that's about how far it goes. You have classroom friends. You have, but then you also have your tight circle of friends who maybe it's just one or two people and they know everything about you, or pretty much everything, right? So there's different levels to friendship, which, Jesus should be in an aspect our friend. So how close of a friend is he? How close of a relationship do we have with him? I don't know how much we actually evaluate that.
That was really good. I was kind of feed off of Kayla, what Kayla said, but so Matt talked about this thing that we're part of. It's called Clubhouse, and they're kind of this discussion about what's the next discussion, and we've started to do that here. But one of the questions Matt brought up was exactly what we're talking about today. Is just about this identity or this term Christian. And so, I mean, the very first thing that came to my mind when Matt proposed this, because there was kind of this thread going on with a few other people, the first question that came to my mind is, who gets to define it? Who gets to define Christian, right? And so, and Kayla, you brought up a great point, because, as we preach, and whoever's preaching they are influenced by who taught them. And so I would say, for me, I was heavily taught by a Western, in a Western system, in a colonial type of system. Not that everything is bad, but there are pieces, that we need to kind of like, step away and walk away from. But I wonder, because I think probably in more recent years, the theologians have been predominantly white, but recently there's theologians that are people of color now. And it's kind of going through the colonial system, going through the Western system, but now they're having a voice, but being able to kind of talk about that. So I guess the question I would have, like for you, Phil, is what you understand a Christian to be within the context of African Americans. Because when Kayla brings up a very important thing, she says, loving God. And so how do we love God? Because, some cultures, like the Hispanic cultures, they don't have money, but what they're willing to do is they're willing to take all the money that they would, maybe the church would expect, the white church would expect them to give. They would take all that money and then have somebody over and honor them with a meal, because that is the most, that's kind of like Jesus' way, right? It's hospitality. And so, part of the question becomes, like Kayla was saying, is like, as Christians, we love. But do we know enough, and who's informed us, and who has shaped our theology, and are we listening to other ethnicities and other groups? And so I guess, Phil, I mean, does when you look at Christianity, because you're doing your research on the Black church, are there a difference, and not a different Jesus, but a different way of looking at Christianity? What does it mean to be a Christian, in that sense? And then also, Matt and Kayla, I mean, you guys, we're in Scotland. I mean, that's a totally different context. And so is there a different way that, people in Scotland look at what it means to be a Christian and how is it defined differently. Not that defining it differently is bad, but within the context of the different voices. And so I guess that would be a question. Maybe for Phil, you could, address that, and maybe Matt and Kayla.
Absolutely. I'll start there. That's good. I remember years ago, probably, I don't know, mid 2000s, 2005, 2007, around there, where there were a lot of younger African American Christians that discovered Calvinism. I don't, discovered it through school, whatever. They discovered Calvinism, and and they were attracted to it because you could explain Calvinism, explain the faith for them. It gave them parameters, it gave things, clear definitions of who we are, what we do, and the like. And I watched several of my brothers and sisters in Christ, young, around my age, they'll be in their 40s now. We were young then, we're not as young now. But I remember watching them flock towards churches that were teaching theology from a Calvinistic perspective. And I remember sitting in a class with our brother, with our brother at Multnomah, thinking, there's a disconnection here between the work that you want to do and the theology that you're talking about. And I remember when I first got introduced to Trinitarian thought with Metzger, I remember thinking, no, this is the perspective that we need to take, because everything involves community and reaching to the other. For me, from a Calvinist perspective, I've seen where I can choose to be concerned with somebody else, but it's really about me and Jesus. This whole thing has been about me and Jesus, kind of thing. And if it's all of us and Jesus, then we're all here in the same party, all, worshiping Jesus together. And that was cool. But I was like, there's a disconnect. Fast forward. So go summer of 2020. A lot of those same Christians are like, whoa, wait a second. How do you guys not care about what's going on, what other believers that don't look like you are feeling? And we had a lot of them. These are several of the ones that are deconstructing their faith now, because it was all based upon a perspective that it was about you and Jesus. So for me, going through seminary, I was aware of the perspective. I learned a lot of it, but it never became me, because I understood there was I felt that there was a disconnect. And meeting Metzger, I was like, oh, wait a second, there's a different way of doing this. So I'm doing this a different way. So that being said, one of the key influences in my life has been Cornel West, the entirety. As I studied throughout my time, I remember listening to Cornel West when I was in high school, and I was stuck. From that point on, I didn't read a whole bunch of his stuff because I just didn't read, because I'm a kid. I didn't read then. But as of late, I listened to a lot of the talks that he does, a lot of lectures. I have owned several of his books now. But for me, I've had Cornel West as kind of a mediating force as I've studied theology along the way. So.
Yes, and it's interesting, even with that. Phil, or Kayla, I don't know if you were going to say something, but it is interesting because Jim, you brought up we spent some time in Scotland doing some education, as well as I taught there at University of St. Andrews. And it is interesting because if you went into where we were at in St. Andrews and you came down and you did a helicopter look, you'd say all those people look pretty much the same. I mean, we really did, I mean, appearance wise, to be honest with you, we fit in fairly good in Scotland, in St. Andrews. So we were like, okay, so it didn't seem like that would be a culture shock. Wow. The first time we went to church, it was a culture shock, for one. And for two, it was interesting, I think, for my kids to be treated differently, and it wasn't how we looked, it was how we sounded. And so then they were asked when we were first there, hey, would you say this, ha ha ha, say this again, all the while we, and this is so Jim, I hear when you say I was raised in this like kind of Western, because our Westernness, to believe it or not, really came out even in Scotland, Western meaning this American westernized version, right? And it came out for our family when we came home the first couple of times after church, and we're like, wait, but we're not different. Like, we're not like they're treating us like we're not like them, like then we're going to the church and stuff. And then what we realized too is there was a difference though of what Phil was saying of, okay, so being known by God, which it starts with God, right? That how do we know to love, right? Because God first loved us. And one of the comments that Sarah, who's been on Uncorked, has said in the comments things is, it's they will know you by the way in which you love one another, right? They'll know you're my disciples. And he's talking to the church. Okay, so how we love even each other, you don't even have to go outside the church, is to, okay, so some people wrestle and go, I can't deal with houselessness and the folks with that because of this and this security and this. Okay, fine. That verse is talking about how Christians, right, the followers of Jesus, as Jim was saying, how they do exactly what Phil was saying, is take that love from God and then turn it, use it, like exploit it so much so in loving the other person in the church. It was interesting when we were in Scotland where there's a difference as to who they think Jesus is and who we thought Jesus was. Like it really was. And talk about that Calvinistic bend, or that I would call it a systematic bend. It was systematizing, because on church on Sunday, there was, like, you thought, wow, this is a booming group. Like they are on fire. The organ is just like loud as all get out. And like, and the preacher's up there and he was given, but then Monday and Tuesday, when we saw some of the people and we were trying to, do the American thing, right? Don't we do a Bible study during the week? And we do this stuff. They were like, why? Like church that was yesterday, and and yet still we don't, like, because I take your point, Jim, like we have to be careful, because who is it that defines it? But don't we know who defines it? I mean, doesn't the Bible give some definitions? And I know people want to balk at this because especially over COVID and wrestling with that, because I'm pretty sure I've read in the Bible that it says, do not neglect getting together, right? There are Christians. So this is serious, even my language. I just throw it out there, right? Like, so there are some people who claim to be a follower of Christ, but does that mean that can they be a follower of Christ and have not set foot in church for the last, however many years? And then with COVID, that does throw a wrench in it, right? Because if I've just said you can't be a Christian and haven't been communing with people and going and gathering with them, then someone could point to me for the last year and a half or the last year before this, when I was taking church online, and say, but you weren't getting together. And then I would justify it by saying, well, we were, but getting together in this certain way. And so that's where, like, in some sense, Jim, like the deconstruction that you're talking about, it almost gets to a point where you expect the deconstruction to be how I'm going to deconstruct what I'm doing is actually righteous and integrous in my eyes, so that you can't judge me. And so what we tend to do is almost deconstruct the faith so much so that I can then put it back together to fit my preferences and my needs and my space. And yet, because I don't want you to judge me, guess what I do with your faith? It's yours. Let him have it. And we don't want to make any kind of accusations, right? Even though I might have the Bible, isn't an accusation if I say, hey, Jim, I'm just wondering, where are you at with, loving this person? And you and we go to our homes and we have this amount of coats, and you and I are able to go to this store and get this. And yet our brother or sister here is living in a pretty beaten down place, and we know it. And so we gather money every Sunday and we give little portions of them, but we've never stepped out and actually given of ourselves, our time. So, like, could that be another aspect of, well, shouldn't a Christian be doing this, and yet how do you do that without being judgmental? And is judgment of one another sinful?
I like to call it accountability.
Okay.
No, I know. Same thing. But okay, you bring up a really good point, Matt, because it does start with the Bible, but the question becomes, who gets to define the Bible, right?
Totally.
Because so far, I mean, the first however many years, we know who's defined the Bible, the white folk, right? And so I think, but I think I think the bigger picture is, who's at the table defining it with you. So I think conversations like these are very, very important, because I think this is that starting place. But also when we talk about deconstruction, I think because by ourselves, really, it's kind of like, I think people just deconstruct it because they say it. I think it's a cop out sometimes of really accountability in the faith, and just saying, "Oh, I'm trying to deconstruct it, and I feel like this is just way too much." It's like, no, you're just lazy. I mean, it really boils down to laziness. But I think when we do deconstruct, and I think it is important, that we need to do it with people of different colors. I mean, we need to do it with like groups like this, especially because, who, how can you with all the racism that continues to go on and some of the things that Phil shared historically, I mean, how can we read the same Bible and allow what's going on to go on, right? I mean, and so I think the problem is that the voices that are allowing injustice and evil to continue on, who say that they're Christian, I know who they're talking with, I know who they're deconstructing with, I know who they're interpreting the Bible with, and I think that becomes the issue. But when we sit together and because it shines light on who is our neighbor and how do I love my neighbor, and those kind of things. So I think maybe the issue becomes deconstruction as far as community. And I think there is a communal side of just reading and understanding the Bible together. And part of the Western culture is like, just tell me what I need to do. Caleb, you bring up a great point, because sometimes people they want to go to a church that just says, give me 3 points and then I can work on those, instead of kind of like, well, what does it mean to love your neighbors? I mean, are you really loving the homeless guy? I mean, are you really positive? I mean, kind of challenging people and even wrestling with it themselves. And so, but I guess my point is I think, discussions like these, but when it comes to deconstruction and interpreting the Bible, I think we have to make sure that, people look different around the table that we're discussing and we're growing with. And, I know we say a lot about different colors. We also have to have the genders there, and we also have to have all ages there.
And no, Jim, when I started at Multnomah, like everything was different. Like I jumped in and everything was like, what? Wait, no one talks in tongues. We're not praying for people at the altar. It was wild to me. But it took me a while to realize, okay, yeah, this is Christian too. And that's what it was. This was Christian also. But thinking of the just the tradition of the African American church, it's really in many ways for a long time been an isolated tradition where you had your own frame of thought that was far more localized, far more particularized to your area and where you were in the area you were ministering. And that really shaped kind of how we look at the Bible. That's so very distinct. I mean, look, when I went to Multnomah, the only Martin Luther I know was Martin Luther King. I have a friend who went to a class and they asked him about early church fathers, and he said, oh man, he said, who did he say? They asked the question, who's your favorite early church father? He said the A.W. Tozer was his favorite early church father. But this is the reality where we don't know what that world is. Don't know the world is. And the funny thing is when you're thinking now, as people are deconstructing and you have people more so looking for African roots now, you have people saying, oh, you realize St. Augustine is African, right? Origin, African. And so it's like, wait, all these things that we thought were European, no, African. And so that becomes the conversation now, where that was a whole nother conversation. Like, wait a second, this was always here, we never known. But then the scary thing is even you have people that come to America from Africa, leaving a long lineage and heritage of theology to come here to learn our brand of theology, to take that back home, that now is further distance from what should have been their home thought. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do in this conversation. And you're right, we have to bring people to the conversation, and just make sure that we're having this conversation together. But at the same token, I think all of us need to be more educated about what we're even looking at. Because when you say, hey, who determines what the Bible is? Yeah, interpretation is the thing that determines what we're talking about. And even the words on the page become skewed if you're not looking at it appropriately, if you're not looking at it accurately, if you're trying to find something rather than trying to allow the Bible to speak on its own. So it's we don't consider our context, that we bring things to the text that shape how we view the text. So yeah.
Yeah, really quickly, Kelly, I want to hear what you have to say too. But and it really is dependent upon the Western culture gets to define who are the professors, who are the ones that are the leaders. I had a friend that was taking a seminary class. She was working on international leadership. So I said, "Oh, so who's the speaker?" Well, I said, "No." I said, "So the speaker, how is it set up? How is that space set up?" I said, "Is it like you're all in rows? The speaker's the one that's dressed the nicest. He has a microphone. He gets to stand up front." And she was like, "Yeah." And I go, "That's not international leadership." I said, "So like in my culture," I said, "the leader, the person that has probably the greatest wisdom, he's the guy with he's got jeans, and one of the pant legs of his jeans is like tucked in his boots that are, his boots, and then he's got like he's got like just a terribly beat up John Deere hat." I said, "In my culture, that's the wisest person." And so, and then even in taking because I did a master's of intercultural studies with North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. I wanted to do that because I wanted to hear, to learn kind of within an indigenous culture and just to inform myself as a Hawaiian. But a lot of the indigenous leaders and people they don't have the alphabets after their names, but they have just as much wisdom. And so the other piece too is that it's not only about the alphabets after your name, although those are significant. I don't want to take away because there is a balance of education but also at the same time there are, and I'm not saying that everybody out there is, but there are some very in indigenous cultures, in other cultures there are some very, very wise, that would be considered professors within their own cultures. We call them kahunas, so just wanted to say that. Kayla, straighten us all up now. We're just like all over the place. So get us back on track and just like slap us around a bit.
No, I was going to say, I think, yeah, education is very like, do your research, right? Like not even, like you said, not necessarily, letters after your name, but knowing what you believe and why you believe it is really important, regardless of if it's, religion or not. You should know what you believe and why you believe something. You should be able to explain it and break it down. And especially in context of what it means to be a Christian, at least for me, I should be able to answer that question. If somebody asks, like, so you're a Christian, what does that mean? That requires, some understanding, some research, some education. I also think it's been really cool to move around and to live in different states and countries because and experience different denominations even. And I think that's a really cool thing too, because you learn the different practices within different cultures. And yeah, like you said, Phil, this is Christian too. And because we have so many different ways of thinking, different perspectives, different practices, different ways to worship our Jesus. And I think that when you step into that and you like ask, how do you spend time with Jesus? What are the ways that you worship him? That just learning different practices of worship can expand and grow your relationship with Jesus so much, because it's really cool to learn about different cultures and how they worship Jesus. And it makes, our relationship with Jesus richer. So it is important to have these dialogues. It's important to have the different perspectives, different cultures, different races, different ages, genders. It's important to have that community. And I think that goes back to what you said at the very beginning, Phil. It's about the relationship with Jesus. It's about what how well Jesus, but it's also in community that we need one another to grow. Because if we don't have that, then it is just a me and Jesus, and you're not going to get very far without community. We learn from each other, and that's how we can learn more about Jesus from each other.
Yeah, I think it's the need of the other that so often maybe makes it a bit difficult for a lot of people, especially I think and I think we have to admit that even if our heritage and our lineage isn't fully like 100, since the beginning of America comes from America, that we all have been influenced by this American mindset, and so I watch it. We were actually talking about this there's certain cultures like where you'll move into America, you'll come from wherever country, and the goal is to attain the American dream. Whatever the American dream is. We were talking, I was actually talking to the owner of the home that we rent, and he's from Iran, and he was talking about how, like, because I was saying how the culture, I mean, the economics are the way it is, where maybe you want to, because this is a second home, obviously, that he owns, and we're renting it. And I said, you might sell it now because you can make a killing because the market might take a dump. And his thing is, no, but I own this because it shows what I've done, and it's not just ownership of one home, it's ownership of a second home. And it didn't matter. And the thing is he's not a bad guy in the sense of wanting to hurt other people, but the way what he's charging for rent is hurting other people. Like, so it's not a nice thing. You know what I'm saying? And so then you get into this question of, well, but if he claimed Christianity, could he do that? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's where, like, what we claim by being known by God is one thing, to then actually take it in and to say, if I'm known by God and then others know me because of being known by God, what then does that play out as? I would tell, either when I would be preaching or even in some of my theology classes, I would tell, my thing would be is, look, if when you put out your sign at Easter for your church and your neighbor's like, I didn't know you were a Christian, you have bigger issues. Okay. Because then we're only being known exactly about what you're saying, Jim, is by the title of Christian. If for me, my identity was bound up in the letters behind my name, then I would hope that each one of you would take me, and I'm not about physical abuse, but sometimes I would need to be shaken a little bit to go, dude, what is your deal? You are not your education. And I would hope someone would come to me and say, also, you're not your experience. Those are all a part of who you are, but this is who you are. And it goes back to one of the original discussions that Phil and I had, even when we started Uncorked, was this truth of Imago Dei, Imago Dei. And that's where I think it really is important. Who are we reading? Because you're absolutely right, Phil. I think people would be like, what? Augustine? Wait, the guy that everyone quotes he's African? And then we'd have to go, well, what is African? Because I was even looking at something where they were saying, this is true Africa, it's the southern portions. If you claim northern Africa, that's not really African, meaning, black, like what we think, because of, I think maybe Elon Musk might be from northern Africa or something like that. And so it's like, no, that's not the Africa that we're talking about, right? And there's then further distinguishing factors, just like what I don't want to get, and I think this is what Jim's talking about, when we have a conversation, I don't want it to be, well, no, not that Christian, i.e., well, because the one thing for me, and maybe I'm just a simplest, maybe I'm just a simple-minded person. If the person acknowledges and recognizes that what Jesus did on the cross, and this idea, this truth, the reality of repentance of sin and my need for a savior, and they claim that they love Jesus, I'm like, bring them to the table. I don't care who you sleep with. I don't care what your skin tone is. I don't care what your background is. In fact, I want you to teach me, so help me to break out of this mold that everyone thinks I am, that I think, right? Because I need your thoughts to help me. That makes a lot of people nervous, because it's what Augustine said, what I live by. Love Jesus and live as you want. What's so difficult about that? Like, I don't understand why we as Christians have such a problem with love, right? Maybe that's the question that we have to go through next week, is talking about this. So we said Christian. What is Christian? And we've talked about this idea of being known by God. And with that comes then this big concept of love. And so next week, we want to step into that. What does that mean? To love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, right? That seems to be two very important things that I think maybe Jesus said, right? What does it all break down to? So even our conversation today, it breaks down to what Jesus said. What would Jesus say? Oh, two greatest things, right? So what does that mean? To love God? Because as Phil said, that means one who wants to love God, maybe, or at least has some concept of being known by God, right? So when we love God, what does that look like? And what does that mean then for our neighbor? And so we'll want to continue this conversation. Any last thoughts before we sign off? Jim, you look like you're itching.
I mean, I guess I want to follow up on the question you have, because we have talked about what love is, right? But maybe even the question becomes, what prevents us from loving? I mean,
Oh,
what is it? I mean, yeah, I mean, we know how to, and we can. I mean, I think, not to say that it's not important, but what prevents us from loving our neighbors in the sense that things like racism, misogyny, all these types of things continue on. I mean, and it's not like things that are in the dark. I mean, it's kind of like, these are like blaring things. These are stuff that are like, that's out there. And so I guess, in addition, because I mean, I love the discussion about loving God, but I mean, what is it prevents us? What prevents people from, you know, we talk about story, right? I mean, what prevents me from saying, well, Phil, that no, people aren't that bad. Come on, Phil, you can't tell me that, that somebody didn't serve you right away because of the color of your skin. Come on, Phil. I mean, things like that prevent us from loving others, right? And so I guess that, so I maybe even exploring, what is it that prevents us from loving others? So I, to kind of add to that, because I mean, the conversation we've about love, it's great, but I just was thinking of a different.
No, I think you're perfect. I think that's what we'll do is, I wrote down, and this is what we're going to say is, so love, we tend to know what love is, because I mean, we can tell you what love is not, right? But in that, what Jim is asking, what prevents us then from love? That's a great question. That's what we're going to explore next week. What truly prevents us? And to say me, I prevent myself. Okay, but what does that mean? Okay. And so to explore that. So that's a great question, because we want to understand, Christian is bound up in love. Okay. So what does all this mean? Because to live is Christ is essential for the Christian. So we must know Christ to understand what it means to live. And so continually stepping into this, because society does talk about love. Question is what kind of love? And then does society offer ways to actually excel in love, or ways to prevent us from loving authentically, as Christ calls us to? And so on behalf of Phil and Jim and Kayla, I'm Matt. We have been just stoked to have you joining us this Friday morning. Go and just live the joy out of today and tomorrow and Sunday, knowing that you are loved by this God of all creation, and you are a beautiful creation who has so much to offer each one of us. And when we hold back, then you hold back from our joy and our just truth of what it means to be. And so we're thankful for that you joined us. Until next Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, talking about love and what prevents us from loving like Jesus loves us. And so until next Friday, another episode of New Wine Uncorked. We'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.